you very much indeed, Finbar. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be back in County Donegal. Every time I'm in Donegal, I seem to see Rory Quinn here because myself and Rory, as education spokespeople for our respective parties, go around to the teacher conferences, and we were in Donegal earlier this year, and we were running around the country together, and to such an extent that my secretary said that we were a bit like Thelma and Louise going around the country for the week or so that was in it. It's great to see Joe Mulholland here today, ladies and gentlemen, the star performer at this summer school for many years. The first time I met Joe, he doesn't remember this, was I was a low member of staff, a very low member of staff, working for John Bruton. And on one particular day, there was a heave against John. There seemed to be quite a number of heaves against John over the years, but there was this one day there was a heave on. So the first question is, who's going to go on 6-1 to defend John? So, needless to say, once we'd established that the deputy leader of the party, Nora Owen, was backing John, she was going to go on to defend John in one of those kind of moments that Jerry Collins had, you know, don't burst up the party, but she was sort of speaking to the Fine Gael rebels at the time. So my job as this low member of staff was to go with Nora to RTE, to hold her hand and to say that you did a great job once the interview was over. And after the interview was over and she did a great job, Joe Mulholland was there and put his arms around Nora. Come in, you have a gin and tonic. And I'll never forget that. I said to myself, that crowd in RTE, they spend their whole time drinking gin and tonic. Isn't it a fantastic job? But of course, ever the newsman, you see, this is the method behind his madness was. He did this to all senior politicians, because the gin and tonic would lead to a story at the front bench or a story at cabinet and what's happening and who's in and who's out. So very clever newsman. I learnt my lesson there. It's a great privilege to be invited back to Glenties to make some remarks on probably the most important question we face right now, how we are going to re-engineer our education system to get this country out of the crisis that it's in right now. And I was interested to see on my way in the whole program here about 1919. Earlier this year, as those of us who are members of the Dáil, we had a commemorative event in the Mansion House to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Dáil. And it was a very significant event. I was very taken by it. I didn't think I would be, but I actually was. And when you think about that 90 years of independence, I do think Irish people, they recognise, yes, we are, I think, the third or the fourth oldest, most continuous democracy in the Western world, that our democracy has stood the test of time, that the Dáil, when it was established by the independence movement, was as much a statement to the international community that we were going to go about our independence in a civilised way. The establishment of Dáil Éireann in 1919 said to the world that not only Ireland had become an independent country, but the route that we were going to follow was a route of democracy and parliamentary democracy. We didn't go the way of fascist Europe in the 1930s and 40s. The Dáil was the means through which the Civil War effectively came to an end, that famous letter that Cosgrave sent to De Valera at the time: if you accept a majority vote of Dáil Éireann, you accept the sovereign wish of the Irish people. And I was very struck by this commemorative event we had in January this year when we all went to the Mansion House, that 90 years of consistent parliamentary democracy. Good times, bad times, but I do think people understand the importance of what the Dáil is, the epicentre of the Irish democratic experience. And the reason I raise that in my opening remarks is because not since independence has this country faced the kinds of challenges we face right now. When you consider that this economy is going to shrink by maybe 9% this year, the potential of another 3% next year, I think there was only 2 years in the 1950s when we saw negative economic growth. Even in the 1980s, in the difficult 1980s, the economy grew, albeit by tiny fractions each year. So we are going to have to get used to a radical transformation of politics and a radical transformation of public services in this country. And if we are going to meet that challenge, I believe that education is absolutely crucial. And what I want to speak about today, I want to say a few words, if I can, about the role of opposition in all this, but I also want to speak about how we are going to reposition our higher education system and how we're going to fund it. I have some ideas on that. I'd like to make some public comments for the first time on the McCarthy report, because I haven't said anything publicly to date since the report came out on education. And I'd also like to say something about reforms in our schooling system, how we can turn our schools around to meet this challenge that is in front of us. What I want to say about the opposition is, at the moment, I suppose the easiest thing to do in opposition is just sit back and say nothing, really. Let the government take the odium from the people, as they did in the recent election, be as constructive as we are, and all the rest of it. But that's not going to get this country out of the crisis that it's in right now. And I want to say it very bluntly. My party cannot be the party of no. We have got to be the party of solutions. We've got to be upfront and honest with the scale of the catastrophe that faces this country. And I say that because we have come from a recent local and European elections where we are now the biggest party. We actually have a new mandate. And that puts more responsibility and an onus on us, as one of the opposition parties, to make sure that we are responsible and to make sure that we are the party driven by solutions. And that means the Dáil must stop being the kind of Punch and Judy theatre that it has become in the last 10 years. One of the great advantages about recessions is that people will come to political meetings like this and other meetings around the country again. One of the advantages is people are interested in politics again. And I think there's a huge challenge on the Dáil itself to rise to that particular challenge. That means Fianna Fáil in particular, the largest government party, they've got to change their act too. They don't do cooperation. Mr. Cowan, when he became Taoiseach, I was there in the Dáil that day, and he used the analogy of Sean Lemass quite a number of times in his remarks to the Dáil on that particular occasion. Well, Brian Cowan is no Sean Lemass. He is a very tribal leader of his party, and if he wants cooperation, and if he's going to transform the atmosphere in the Dáil, he has got to show in his actions and in his response to the opposition exactly if that new era of cooperation. Because I think the people expect us to be a responsible opposition, and the people expect us, of course, to scrutinise, to put the government under pressure, to make sure that the tough questions are asked, but also to sketch out a future for this country, to support the things we've got to support, and also to put alternatives that are there. And one of the areas where I think we can make some agreement, certainly from Fine Gael's perspective, is on this question of funding higher education. Now, before I say that, why do people go to college? You know, your mother wants you to go to college. Parental expectations are a big driver why people go to college. You know, your mother thinks you should be there. Will I go? Your mates go to college. It's another big driver. Someone once said to me that going to college is a bit like a form of social endogamy. You end up marrying the person who's sitting next to you in a lecture theatre. There's a kind of a connectivity that's there, or your partner, you meet your partner there. But I think if we are to meet a new agreement on the issue of higher education, I want to set out the reasons why I think that will be good for the country. I think first and foremost, if we did find agreement about a new mechanism of funding higher education, I think it would send out a very positive signal to the international community that Ireland is trying to reposition higher education to meet the challenges that are going on in the economy right now. And I think people will recognise internationally that we're going to put higher education onto a new plane by this new funding model. So I think that would be good. I also think it's crucial that we bring some certainty to this ongoing debate which the Minister launched this time last year on the question of funding. It is not fair for kids who are going into college this October that this issue continues to go out there without any kind of certainty. It's not fair to themselves, to their parents, to their families. So we need some certainty. The other issue is this. We do face a financial crisis within the university sector in particular. And it's largely because we have seen such a massive rise in the number of people going to college over the past 10 years, a massive rise in the number of places. And we haven't kept pace with the funding for higher education. So that financial deficit is not going away anywhere fast. It's going to grow and grow unless we resolve it. The other reason I think it's important why we address this issue is there are two universities in Northern Ireland which both have Tony Blair's top-up fees, which give this additional financial resource to those colleges in the north. which in effect give a kind of competitive advantage to northern universities and equally to universities in other parts of Britain, where effectively they have had this in place for the past number of years. The other argument I would say is if we get more money into higher education, it takes the pressure off primary and post-primary, where the real deficit in funding is. Effectively, we get education on the cheap in this country, particularly when it comes to primary and post-primary education. And for me, being blunt about it, my priority is for the 100% of kids who are in our national schools and the 95% of kids who work all the way through in our post-primary schools. So, as against the 66% of people who go on to higher education. So, I think if we're honest about it, if we get more money for higher education, it allows us to concentrate more funding on primary and post-primary. And the other reason I would say is this. 2/3 of 18-year-olds now go on to higher education. I think it is an entirely good thing if we are asking them to make a small contribution towards their education, that they will think about their education, that they will think about the course that they want to do, and that they will effectively, that will help in terms of generating additional responsibility to the whole question of what kind of education do they want. One thing that I'm absolutely certain about, and I've said publicly before, we are not going back to fees. I very much welcome the fact that it was a Rainbow government that abolished fees in 1996. And it was as much about tax reform as it was about higher education funding. Because the PAYE sector were absolutely screwed in the administration of those fees. If you were wealthy enough, you could get a tax covenant. If your father was self-employed, he could cook his books to ensure that you didn't have to pay the fees, that you got maintenance. It was totally biased against the PAYE sector. I remember when John Bruton came into our parliamentary party that day and he said, I want you to sell this as a tax reform. I found it very interesting because it was a very substantial issue, particularly in areas where PAYE sector are absolutely screwed because of the administration of those funds. So we're not going back to that. And I've given that absolute certainty on behalf of the position that I have taken up. And I want to also compliment that Rainbow government, Rory was a member of it, because that decision to abolish fees, in my view, has led to this radical increase in participation rates. We had 120,000 then, we have 170,000 now in higher education. An extraordinary increase of about 40-odd% in participation in about a 12, 13-year period. Sorry, about a 15-year period. So I think the decision to abolish fees was absolutely central to improving participation. But now we've got to find a solution to the crisis that's there. And it's not going to be solved on the tax side of it because of the crisis that exists in other parts of the economy. Now my proposal is, and I've said this publicly before and I'd like to reiterate it today, I'm arguing we should have a deferred contribution system whereby students would pay back something through the tax system related to the cost of their course. I've said it could be up to 30%. I'm not absolutely certain and definite on that 30% figure, but I said it could be up to 30% of the cost of their undergraduate degree course. So assuming you can get work and assuming your income rises above a certain income threshold, you would then pay a contribution up to 30% of your undergraduate course through the PRSI system. And that money would then be ring-fenced, as we have under the Social Insurance Fund, for the purposes of funding higher education. It would not be used for other purposes. It couldn't be hived off to other aspects of education. It would be there for higher education exclusively. And the reason I'm saying that is, we have a tax and social welfare system, a revenue system that's clear. We're very good in this country at taking money away from people and putting it into certain areas. And I think we should use a PRSI system as a means of generating that contribution, keeping that contribution for higher education, and using it for the purposes of reform. And I want to say this to the universities, and John is here beside me today. It can't just be about kids funding the financial crisis that's there in the university sector. This will mean a radical transformation, ultimately, in how not only we fund higher education, but how the student relates with the university or the Institute of Technology. If you're asking kids to pay for something, it immediately changes the relationship that that student has with their college. So it can't be business as usual. Too much of this whole debate is based on bums on seats, where everyone gets a percentage of the cake without specific goals being set and without real quality assurance. And I want to make this point that if we are moving to this brave new world, there will be an absolute responsibility on the part of the universities and institutes of technology to up their game, to improve their performance, and to make sure that what they are producing for their students is world class and is something that we can all stand over. What I've said is also this, that I would not propose moving to this new system of a deferred contribution system until such a time as we have a radical reform programme in place within our universities and within our institutes of technology. We've got to reposition higher education if we're going to meet these economic challenges. One of the issues that I have raised to date has been the question of trying to encourage greater coordination between the universities and the institutes of technology and between the universities themselves. There's far too much of this Me Too attitude that exists in higher education, where we have a replication of every course in every college. Well, that has got to come to an end. It would make much more sense if colleges specialised in core subjects as a means of becoming world leaders in that particular area. I also think it's very important that higher education is taken out of the Department of Education. We have possibly the most dysfunctional Department of Education of any department in the land. It's far too big. Higher education has grown entirely. I would believe that higher education should be realigned with a new Department of Learning, Training and Enterprise. And effectively, our Department of Education will become a Department of Schools, where we would focus on key issues within our primary and post-primary sector. But I have to say this, the reform agenda has got to be allied to the notion of new contributions. You can't have one without the other. We're not going back to this simplistic idea that we're simply going to give a percentage of this new amount of money to all of the higher education sector. In my view, that's not going to work, and it's not sensible in the long run. I'd like to make some comments, if I may, on the McCarthy issue, which has loomed large for the past number of days. It's only fair to say that no department can be immune from what the Minister for Finance called these adjustments. The idea that the Department of Education and the education budget is going to be utterly ring-fenced without any changes to it, and that other departments will find savings, is absolute nonsense. And I think we've got to be upfront and honest about that, rather than pretending that we can ring-fence everything within the budget. What I think we've got to ring-fence, in my view, is the frontline staff. And the most important hardware that you have in any education system are your teachers. I want to make it absolutely clear that I will not support any reduction in the number of teachers in our primary and post-primary system under any set of circumstances. Because it is crazy at a time when we're likely to have maybe 50,000 net additional kids coming into our primary school system over the next number of years, that we're talking about taking teachers out of the system, that we're taking teachers out of post-primary schools, when we're trying to provide a range of choice within those post-primary schools to meet a curricular need that those children have. That makes no sense, and I won't support that. It's also entirely stupid to say that each department should find 3% or 4% there. In my view, each department needs to go through its budget and needs to weed out what is essential and what is not essential, because our key priority must be to keep frontline staff in place. And there are many agencies that could be amalgamated. We have far too many VECs in this country. It doesn't make sense in a population the size of Greater Manchester to have 33 separate education authorities. That does not make sense, and we're going to have to do something about that. There are many agents. Every problem that previous ministers of education had in the last 10 years was solved by a new agency within the Department of Education. That has got to change if we're serious about prioritising the front line. And we also need to say, and I want to say this to all the partners in education, there's far too much territorialism in Irish education. We've far too many partners in education as well. While choice is a very good thing, the reality is this: we've got 35 separate partners in education. And they all bring their own unique contribution to bear. But I get a sense, as spokesperson for the past 2.5 years or so, that People are very obsessed with their own area and they don't see the bigger picture. And that's the same for unions as it is for political parties. So I think we've got to make sure that we deal with this issue of territorialism once and for all. And I want to make a simple proposal. We now have the McCarthy report. He has identified potential savings in the education budget. I think the Education Committee of the Dáil and Seanad, the Joint Committee, myself and Rory are members of this committee, should take September and October as times where we would invite in the partners in education to get their reaction to this. Not on the basis of what they're for, not on the basis of what they're against in it, but what are they for. I think it is possible that we can arrive at a consensus on efficiencies and cost savings within the education budget. I think it's possible if we have a public discussion on this in the lead up to the budget, we could get agreement, not on everything, but I certainly think we could get agreement on some essential savings which are required to get us through this particular crisis. And I would encourage the social partners to use that opportunity. I want to make that proposal today, that we would have this debate in public where they would come in a public way to look at savings and efficiencies, and that we would use the vehicle of the Joint Education and Science Committee as a means of trying to get some agreement, because otherwise we will get no leadership. And I think there are savings there which can be identified, which mean we will not have to get rid of frontline staff. There's three key points I want to make about education and the key to recovery. We don't spend enough on education in this country, largely because of history. For many years, the religious provided free of charge, and that's coming to an end, obviously. We don't spend enough internationally, and what we do spend is spent so thinly across the entire system as sometimes not to make a difference. That's a problem we face. We also have a problem that we have this view of education, that education is for people from the ages of 5 to 21. That if you're in your 40s and you want to go back to college to study something, or if you're in your 60s and you want to retire to do something else, you don't really fit in. Really successful economies encourage lifelong learning, encourage the notion of education as something which takes place throughout your life, rather than this moment between 5 and 21, 22 years of age. And we've got to radically change that if we're serious about dealing with the challenges that are there in the economy at the moment. The other big change we need is we need to decentralize power to schools. We have the most Stalinist Department of Education, the kind of mothership that fixes everything from window frames to preparing a circular on a nuclear winter. This place is extraordinary and very frustrating to deal with, I can tell you, at the best of times. And what we need to do is a radical program of decentralization within our school system. It is a joke, quite frankly, that principals spend so much time form-filling. I mean, show me the, I've made this point constantly, show me the bad principal in a good school. There's no such place. Good schools follow good principles. And the key thing we have got to do right now, we've got to concentrate on the quality of teaching, the quality of that experience for our students, and the quality of leadership in our schools. They are the two most important ingredients. I'm a great fan of Tony Blair, not on his adventures in Iraq, but what he did in education was very important. What Blair said in education was this: I am going to increase your budgets. I am going to improve the money that we put into education in the United Kingdom. But I'm also going to demand accountability for that. I'm going to demand that we reach certain standards. And I think that is the aspect of accountability in education that we need to put center stage right now if we're going to meet these economic challenges. Primarily because you know, the experience of a teacher in front of students is an absolutely pivotal experience, whether or not success can be engendered in that particular child. And I think it's very important. Can I say this finally, because I think I'm after my time? There's been a lot of negative comments made about teaching and teachers since McCarthy came out last week, and this kind of tabloid attack on teachers. I'm fed up of it. Teaching is important. Really successful economies value teaching. We need the best people in this country to go into teaching. We need the brightest, we need the most ambitious. And you know, it's a privilege for me going around schools and seeing in our schools, really, really committed people. There's also people there who shouldn't be there. First one to admit it. But they're not in any way a significant group of people. I said recently to the INTO that I think 40% of their members have joined in the last 10 years. An extraordinary opportunity for radical change within the profession and radical change of the perception. And I just want to make this point that, you know, bashing teachers, which is a sideline of some particular newspapers, is not going to get us through this. We need people to work with us on this adjustment, on this reform programme, and to make sure that the quality product that we have is supported and engendered in the years to come as a means of getting us out of this particular crisis. I could say an awful lot more, but Finbar says to me that I have a red card, so thank you very much for your attention.